I used to say that I would never hitchhike, and after trying it for the first time, I can reassure you that I'm now sticking to that statement. It was shortly after I graduated from college that I decided to walk from the top of the east coast of the United States to the southernmost point. It was something that I had always wanted to do, but I never expected that it would be so difficult. The first week of the walk wasn't really that bad, after I had finally adjusted to a decent schedule. I was actually making a pretty good pace, and as far as I could tell, it was going to be a great adventure. On my 11th day into the walk, though, everything started to go downhill. As I walked along the side of the highway, since it was the best and most suggested route to get me to the next off-road trail that I was going to take, I managed to drop my phone and broke it. If that was the worst part of my day, though, I would honestly have called it a win. But it wasn't even close. I planned on stopping in the next store that I saw so that I could purchase a prepaid phone that would last me the rest of the trip. But little did I realize I wouldn't be seeing an actual town for another day or so on foot. I kept on walking on the highway for about an hour, but by that point, it was around 4 in the afternoon and I could see that the sun was starting to get a bit lower in the sky. To make matters worse, I could also see a mass of dark storm clouds on the horizon. Because I didn't know when my next chance to find shelter was going to be, I decided to break my one rule and I stuck out my thumb, hoping that someone would pick me up and bring me to the nearest town or city. It took about another hour before a car stopped, and by that point, it had already started to pour and I was soaking wet. I wasn't even paying attention to the type of car that pulled over. I just ran right up to the window and explained my situation. As I finished telling the man what happened, I looked up at him more clearly and my heart just about dropped when I saw that he was holding up a large silver revolver and pointing it right at me. "Get in the car," he said through yellowed teeth. I was frozen with fear, but when I didn't move, the man only got louder. "Get in my car right now or I'll blow your head off." I slowly reached for the handle and got into the car, hoping that the man would put the gun down. Before I even closed the door, he started pulling back on the road. I looked over to the man who had a massive smile on his face, almost as if he was laughing to himself. I could see that the gun was still pointed at me, although now it was lower and more in his lap than it was before. I kept looking out the window as we sped down the road, wondering if there was any way that I could get out of the car safely. I could hardly think straight, though, with the man's deranged muttering. All I could make out from what sounded like gibberish was the phrase, "Have fun tonight," which he kept saying every couple of seconds like he was tweaking. As we continued to drive, I noticed that there was a car on the road behind us, and after a minute or so, they had managed to get pretty close to the car that I had been forced into. Something in me told me that this would be my only chance to get away from that man without getting shot. I took in a single breath, and then as fast as I could, I unlocked the door and leaned into it, forcing it to swing open as we drove down the highway. I rolled out of the car as the door opened, and I can still remember the pain I felt as my head smacked into the pavement as I rolled. Thankfully, the car behind us stopped when they saw me fall out onto the road, because I couldn't get up on my own. They ran right over to me, and when they asked if I was okay, all I could remember saying was, "Help, call the police." After that, everything slowly faded to black, and the next thing I remember, it was 2 days later and I was waking up in a hospital bed. Once I was awake, I called my family to let them know where I was and what happened to me, and I waited for the police who brought me to the hospital to take my statement. They also spoke to the driver of the car who helped me out, and they got a pretty good description of the creep who tried to kidnap me. Apparently, he tried to convince them to let him take me to the hospital, but when the driver who saved me refused, he got angry and left in a fit. It took a couple of hours for my family to get to the hospital that I was staying in, but once they did, I finally felt some semblance of safety again. I've lived in the same area for my entire life, and honestly, we never really had a problem when it came to picking up hitchhikers. Since everyone basically knew everyone in my area, odds are if someone saw you walking along the side of the road, they were going to stop and ask you if you needed a ride. especially if the weather was bad that day, which is why I had no problem pulling off to the side of the road when I saw a young man with his thumb pointed out toward the road one night after it just started pouring rain. I rolled the window down and asked him where he was heading, and he told me that he lived a few minutes up the road. I assumed he meant on the way to town, so I told him to hop in and I'd give him a ride. He seemed really appreciative at first, but I have to admit that I felt a little weird at first when I didn't recognize him. I asked him how long he's lived around here, and he told me that he just moved to the area just a few months before and was only going to be staying for a few more weeks. I thought that was interesting, but didn't want to pry too much about his life and just continued to make my normal small talk. Eventually, he told me to make a right on the road coming up ahead. I recognized the road as the same one that led to the quarry that we all used to hang out at when we were children. The odd thing was, I didn't remember there being any houses on that road. I looked around as I slowly drove up the narrow street that slowly turned from pavement to gravel. No matter which side of the car I looked out of, though, I wasn't seeing any signs of housing. That was when I noticed that man staring at me. It wasn't like he just glanced in my direction either. At that moment, as I was looking around, I realized that he had been looking right at me without saying anything from the moment that we pulled onto this road. I looked back at him and noticed that he had this intense-looking smirk on his face, as if he was trying to hold back a sinister smile. "Where'd you say you lived?" I asked him, but he didn't respond. "You know, I used to come up this road all the time when I was younger, and I don't think I've ever seen a house up here. When did they build yours?" I asked, hoping that he would have an explanation for me. Instead of an answer, though, he responded with a question. "Have you figured it out yet?" he asked. I looked back at him as I continued to drive up the wet gravel pathway. His eyes locked onto mine and then glanced down toward his hands, and when I followed them, I noticed that he had a gun that was pointed right at me. Countless thoughts rushed through my head, and not a single one of them was a good one. The only words I could muster as I took my foot off the gas and slowed the car down was, "Please don't do this." The man responded in a calm and cold tone. "Don't worry, man. I just need your car to get out of here." I didn't hesitate as I told him that he could have the car and begged him not to hurt me. He kept his calm demeanor as he said, "Now I just need you to step out of the car, and I'll make this as quick as I can." I put the car into park and unbuckled my seatbelt before opening the door. As I stepped out into the rain, I hoped that the man would just hop into the driver's seat and pull off without another word. But when I heard the sound of him stepping out of the car behind me, I knew he had different plans. I felt the cold metal of the gun pressed up against the back of my head. "Walk forward," he said. "Walk forward and I'll make this quick." I didn't know what to do. All I could think was to run away and hope that he couldn't hit me in the dark and through the rain. I started by taking a slow step forward, and then without wasting any more time, I took off running as fast as I could. I heard the sound of the gun go off behind me, but once I realized I hadn't been hit, I just kept sprinting. I remember hitting my legs on every root and branch sticking out of the ground as I ran through the nearly pitch-black forest, just hoping that I wasn't being followed. It took me about 20 minutes to make it safely to the main road, where I waited until I saw headlights that were passing by. I flagged the car down, and it turned out to be an old family friend of mine. I explained what happened, and they drove me to the police station to report my vehicle as stolen. Interestingly enough, they found my car a few days later, about 7 hours away, with no fuel in the tank, but there was no sign of the man I had picked up that night. I was 15 years old when I was walking home from a high school football game and was almost picked up by someone who mistook me for a hitchhiker. You see, my school was about a 5-minute walk from my house, which was just outside of the town that I lived in. And because both of my parents worked late sometimes, I got pretty used to walking home from school or from events at the school. That night, I decided to beat the traffic and left the school about 20 minutes before the game ended so that I can get home safely. At least, that was my plan. As I made my way down the road from the school and out of what we considered to be town, I made sure to keep myself all the way on the side of the road. I kept my headphones off my head and always made sure to be on the lookout for any driver who might be swerving a bit too much. By this point, I was about 3 minutes away from my house when I noticed a set of headlights pulling up behind me. I just assumed that it was a car that was slowing down before passing me out of the respect for my safety. But as they got closer and closer, I could tell that they were slowing down to get my attention. I looked over toward the road, and before I could even see the person in the car, I heard them call out in a relatively deep voice, "Hey, where are you headed?" The words didn't register right away as I tried to figure out if I recognized who was talking to me. "Do you want a ride?" they asked, at which point I realized I had never seen them before. I leaned down so that my head was in line with their window, and as weird as it was for a stranger to ask if I needed a ride, I tried to be polite as I said, "No thank you, I live up the road here." I waved and got ready to continue walking, hoping that the stranger would just drive on by without saying anything else. As I walked, I waited to see the headlights move as if they were starting to pass me, but at first, they didn't budge an inch. Finally, I saw them start to move a little bit forward, and just as I was starting to feel relieved, I could hear the sound of the tires slowly pulling onto the shoulder of the road where I was walking. I could feel my heart starting to beat faster and faster as I realized that for some reason the person had pulled up and parked their car right behind me. I kept walking but flinched as I heard the squeaking sound of the car door swinging open. "Hey!" I heard the man call out from behind. "I'm talking to you. Didn't your parents teach you any manners?" he asked aggressively. I started walking faster as I heard the sound of the car door closing, followed by footsteps on the pavement behind me. I took in a deep breath as I tried to figure out what I was going to do if the man kept following me. But before I could figure out any sort of plan, he said something that really freaked me out. "You can walk all you want, but you'll never get away from me," the man said in a very calm tone that, even though he was about 10 feet behind me or more, sounded like he was right next to me. What was really scary about what he said, though, was the fact that he sounded like he meant it. The next thing I knew, I heard his pace pick up behind me, and I knew I couldn't think anymore. I needed to get away before he caught up. I started running down the road as fast as I could, and because of how hard my feet were hitting the pavement, I could no longer tell if the man was following me or not. After running for about 20 seconds, I hoped that I put enough distance between us before I decided to cut into the small patch of trees off to the side of the road. I knew that if I could run through the small bit of woods, I would get to a house where I could knock on the door and ask for help. I did my best not to look behind me as I ran through the trees, but with each step I took, I feared that the man was going to grab a hold of me. After running for what felt like forever, I finally made it to the fenced-in yard of one of my classmates. I hopped over the wooden fence and ran up to the back door. As I banged on the door, all I could do was hope that someone was home and that they weren't at the game. Thankfully, the kid's older brother came to the door, and after seeing me in a panic, he let me inside. It was just us in the house because his parents were at the game with my classmate. I used their house phone to call my parents and let them know what happened. They both came to pick me up, and after they got me, we all waited for my classmates' parents to get home so that we can let them know what had happened as well. My parents filed a police report, and I told the officers everything that happened. But as far as I know, they never found whoever it was that tried to get me into their car.